Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. When you think of alchemy, your mind might turn to images of secret laboratories, bubbling vessels, and men chasing the dream of turning lead into gold. But for many alchemists of the Middle Ages, the furnace was not only about metals, it was about medicine, philosophy, and even salvation. One of the most famous of these men was Arnaldus of Villanova c. 1242-1311, a Catalan physician, translator, and alchemist whose life ended under a cloud of controversy. Arnaldus was no obscure figure. He was renowned across Europe as a doctor, treating nobles, kings, and even popes. He studied at Montpellier, one of the great centers of medieval medicine, and became famous for his skill in diagnosing illness and for his writings on diet, hygiene, and the prevention of disease. His treatises were copied widely, influencing physicians for generations. But Arnaldus was not only a physician, he was also an alchemist. He translated Arabic texts into Latin, bringing knowledge of distillation, chemical preparation, and mineral remedies into the European world. To Arnaldus, alchemy was not only about gold, it was about health, about understanding the hidden forces God had placed in nature. He believed that metals, like human bodies, had a life cycle, and that purification was as spiritual as it was physical. This blending of medicine and alchemy made Arnaldus both respected and suspect. The church tolerated alchemy when it was framed as practical creating medicines, preparing dyes, distilling waters. But when it strayed into promises of transmutation or eternal life, suspicion grew. Arnold is in his writings sometimes veered dangerously close to theological speculation. He wrote about the end of the world, about prophecies, about spiritual purification through alchemy. These ideas attracted attention, not all of it welcome. By the end of his life, Arnaldus had enemies. His treatises were condemned by the University of Paris. Some of his works were accused of heresy, yet his reputation as a healer kept him in demand. In 1311, he was summoned once again, this time to treat the Pope himself, Clement V, at Avignon. Arnaldus set out by ship, but he never arrived. He died on the journey, and with him, some say, perished writings too dangerous for the church to preserve. The details of his final days are sparse. Chronicles tell us that he fell ill on board, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from disease. Others hint that he was silenced deliberately, his controversial ideas buried along with his body. What we know is that after his death, many of his works were censored, burned, or locked away. Whole treatises disappeared, surviving only in scattered references. It is as though parts of his thought were deliberately erased. Why? Was it his alchemical experiments, too bold for orthodox medicine? Was it his apocalyptic predictions, too unsettling for the church? Or was it that Arnaldus, in his final writings, blurred the boundaries between science, faith, and heresy in a way that threatened authority? The truth lies buried in manuscripts, lost or destroyed, but fragments serve enough to hint at a mind wrestling with questions larger than medicine. In his writings, he spoke of purification, of transformation, of the hidden powers God had placed in nature for humanity to discover. His furnace was not just a place for metals, but for the human soul. And so, we are left with the mystery in the final days of Arnaldus of Villanova. What exactly did he write or say that led not only to his death at sea, but to his partial erasure from history? Asterisk, when you look at the surviving works of Arnaldus of Villanova, something stands out immediately. The mixture of practical medical instruction and theological speculation. He wrote treatises on urine analysis, on the benefits of wine in moderation, on the best diets for different temperaments, squarely within the tradition of medieval medicine. But side by side with these practical texts, you find writings about prophecy, about the Antichrist, about the purification of the world through fire. This strange combination is what earned him both admiration and condemnation. The University of Paris, the great arbiter of medieval orthodoxy in scholarship, had already condemned certain alchemical writings by the late 13th century. They feared that alchemists, in their pursuit of transmutation, were not only misleading the gullible with false promises of gold, but also trespassing into areas of divine creation. To claim that humans could perfect metals was too close to claiming that humans could rival God's creative power. Harnadas, who sometimes wrote about metals undergoing spiritual growth, walked a dangerous line. Then there were his apocalyptic writings. He believed that the end of the world was imminent, that signs in the heavens and the corruption of the church pointed toward the coming of the Antichrist. He was not alone in such beliefs. Many medieval thinkers speculated on the end times, but Canas wrote about them with unusual urgency. He calculated dates, warned of coming trials, and urged reform. For the papacy, this was not only unsettling, it was dangerous. So prophecy could undermine authority, suggesting that existing institutions were doomed. Add to this his alchemical views, and you'll begin to see why parts of his legacy were suppressed. Some of his works were placed on lists of heretical writings. Others survived only in partial manuscripts, copied by sympathetic readers in secret. The fact that so many of his texts are fragmentary today suggests active efforts at erasure. Yet, Arnaldus was not some fringe figure scribbling in obscurity. He treated kings and popes. His medical skills gave him access to the highest circles of power. His patients valued his learning even as universities condemned his theories. This tension between acceptance and practice and rejection in doctrine is part of what makes him fascinating. What, then, might he have written in his final days? Some scholars suggest that he was working on a synthesis of his medical and prophetic ideas, a text that linked physical health, alchemical transformation, and spiritual purification into one vision. If so, such a text would have been highly threatening to the church, which guarded the boundaries of theology carefully. Others believe that his final writings included stronger predictions about the papacy itself, foretelling its decline or corruption. Such claims, if they reached Avignon, would have been intolerable. We must remember the context. Arnaldus died in 1311, on his way to Pope Clement V. This was the very pope who would later suppress the Knights Templar under pressure from King Philip IV of France, a ruler deeply suspicious of heterodoxy and secret knowledge. If Arnaldus carried writings that questioned papal authority, or that blurred the line between divine revelation and alchemical speculation, they may never have reached their destination. They may have been destroyed at sea, or confiscated, or buried with him. The silence of history is telling. After his death, Arnaldus' reputation shifted. Some hailed him as a wise physician. Others condemned him as a dangerous visionary. His name became entangled with apocryphal textbooks attributed to him, but likely written by others, used to lend authority to controversial ideas. His identity blurred, his authorship muddied. This too is a form of erasure, when your name circulates widely, but in distorted form, till your true voice is lost. Archaeologists and historians today study the manuscripts that survive in libraries, from Barcelona to Bologna. Some contain careful diagrams of furnaces, notes on distillation, recipes for remedies. Others are dense with scriptural references, timelines of the end of days, warnings of corruption. Piecing these fragments together is slow work, requiring comparison of handwriting, ink, parchment. It is boring history in the truest sense, patient, methodical, full of small details that only gradually form a picture. And yet, the more one studies, the clearer the paradox becomes. Arnautis was a man at the crossroads: medicine and alchemy, faith and heresy, practical healing and prophetic vision. In his final days, he may have tried to weave these threads together into one, and that weaving, if it ever reached parchment, may have been precisely what condemned him to partial oblivion. But we are left with the haunting question: if such a manuscript ever existed, what did it say that made it so dangerous? Did it predict the downfall of the very institutions he served? Did it claim that alchemy could purify not only metals, but the church itself? Or did it simply blur too many lines, leaving no safe place for his thought to rest? Asterisk. When Arnautis of Villanova died in 1311, his body was buried, but parts of his mind were buried with him. Not in the soil, but in the silence of missing manuscripts, in the deliberate suppression of ideas that lingered too close to heresy. What survives of him today is only partial: a physician whose medical advice was copied in universities, and a visionary whose most controversial works were erased or left to drift in fragments. The erasure was not total. Its influence continued. In medicine, its regimen, Sanititas ad regem Aragonama, text written for the King of Aragon on health and hygiene, circulated widely. It advised moderation in diet, the importance of clean air, the balance of humors. These were practical ideas, fully acceptable to orthodox medicine. Physicians quoted him for centuries, but his prophetic and alchemical writings tell another story. Many were condemned. Some were misattributed to other authors, intentionally or not. In later centuries, texts bearing his name appeared that he likely never wrote, blending genuine fragments with spurious additions. His identity blurred, his thought scattered. This is how erasure often works in history, not with fire and destruction alone, but with distortion, confusion, and neglect. Yet in the very act of suppression, a trace remains. The condemnations of the University of Paris preserve his name. The denunciations of theologians show what ideas alarmed them. His enemies ensured that we remember him, even if in shadow. What disappears entirely leaves no record. What is fought against lingers. So what might he have written in those final days before boarding the ship to Avignon? Perhaps a treatise, blending medicine, alchemy, and apocalyptic vision, a dangerous synthesis. Perhaps a warning to the Pope himself, urging reform or foretelling corruption. Perhaps nothing at all, merely the ordinary writings of a physician, later exaggerated by rumor. The absence of certainty is part of his legacy. What is certain is the effect of his life. He embodied the tensions of his time. He was a healer who sought to improve daily life through regimen and medicine. He was also a thinker, drawn to alchemy, searching for hidden powers in nature. And he was a prophet who believed history itself was moving toward an end. Each of these roles was acceptable on its own. Together, they formed a figure too complex for institutions to tolerate. The silence of his missing writings asks us to reflect on how knowledge survives. It is not always the most brilliant or daring ideas that endure, but those that fit comfortably within structures of power. Arnautis' practical medical texts lived on. His visionary writings did not. What survives is shaped not only by what is written, but by what is allowed to remain. When you hear his name today, it is almost always in passing, in footnotes of medical history or lists of condemned thinkers. Rarely do we pause to consider the man who once treated kings and popes, who once imagined the purification of both metals and souls. His furnace went cold, his manuscripts scattered, his voice muffled. And yet, in that muffling, there is an echo strong enough for us to hear across 7 centuries. So we are left with a final reflection. Perhaps Arnautis of Villanova was not erased entirely. Perhaps the act of trying to erase him, of condemning, censoring, forgetting, has ensured that we remember him if only as a shadow. Missing manuscripts may never resurface, but the question remains unanswerable and therefore enduring. What did a dying alchemist write that made him too dangerous to preserve? Asterisk, after Paracelsus fled Basel in 1528, his life became restless. He wandered across Europe, from Alsace to Austria, from Cologne to Salzburg, always searching for patronage, always writing, always quarreling with the authorities of medicine. He never again held a secure university post. Instead, he lived as an itinerant healer, carrying his manuscripts with him, leaving fragments of his thought scattered across the continent. Exile sharpened his defiance. No longer bound by the expectations of Basel, he wrote freely, though often in haste and without polish. His Latin was uneven, his German blunt, his style abrupt. He did not care for elegant phrasing. He wanted force, immediacy. He attacked learned doctors for clinging to Galen, mocked university professors as apes of dead authorities, and urged readers to trust experience above tradition. He claimed that God had hidden secrets in the natural world, accessible through alchemical practice, not through scholastic disputation. This writing was revolutionary, but also dangerous. To publish such claims in a university city invited condemnation. So many of his works remained in manuscript, copied privately, circulated quietly. Even after his death in 1541, editors hesitated. Some chose only parts of his writings, cutting sections that attacked the church or ridiculed universities. Others attributed spurious works to him, muddying his voice with texts he never wrote. The result was a corpus both vast and uncertain, many volumes bearing his name, but not all authentically his, and many of his authentic texts lost or fragmented in exile. Paracelsus also deepened his theology. He wrote not only as a physician, but as a prophet. He described the body as a microcosm of the universe, shaped by divine forces. He argued that diseases had spiritual as well as physical causes, and that healing required not just medicine, but harmony with God's creation. These ideas unsettled authorities. To claim prophetic insight was to step into dangerous ground, to close to heresy, too far from university medicine. The suppression of his writings can be traced in small, tedious, detailed catalogs of manuscripts, notes in margins, editions published decades late. In some libraries, only fragments remain, single chapters of treatises whose rest is missing. Sometimes a work survives in Latin, but not in German, or vice versa. Sometimes titles are listed in inventories, but no text survives at all. These absences are not accidental. They reflect decisions: what to copy, what to print, what to suppress. Paracelsus himself contributed to this erasure. He was known to destroy drafts, dissatisfied with his own work. He left manuscripts behind in cities he fled, sometimes seized by authorities, sometimes lost by neglect. He wrote prolifically, but without a system of preservation. His defiance of order extended to his own legacy. And yet, in what survives, one sees glimpses of the missing. He refers to works he planned but never finished, 2 treatises he carried but which are now gone. He mentions insights too dangerous to reveal, hints at secrets he would entrust only to select disciples. These scattered references tease us with the possibility of lost knowledge. In Basel, the ashes of Galen and Avicenna symbolized his break with the past, but scattered across Europe in libraries and archives. The missing manuscripts of Paracelsus symbolize another kind of loss, the erasure of ideas, too radical, too chaotic, or too threatening to endure intact. So we must ask, what knowledge slipped through the cracks of his wanderings? Did he record discoveries about poisons, minerals, or diseases that could have changed medicine sooner had they survived? Or were his most radical thoughts suppressed because they challenged not just physicians, but the very structures of learning and belief in 16th century Europe? Asterisk Paracelsus died in 1541 in Salzburg, under circumstances that remain unclear. Some accounts say he succumbed to natural illness. Others suggest he was injured in a tavern quarrel, thrown from a height, his body broken. Whatever the cause, he was only in his late 40s. He left behind no grand library, no carefully preserved legacy, but instead a trail of scattered manuscripts, some carried by followers, others abandoned in places he had fled. His enemies wasted little time shaping his memory. The suppression of his works began almost immediately. Printers were cautious. Some chose to issue only the safer, more practical medical writings, treatises on syphilis, on distillation, on toxicology. Others delayed printing altogether, leaving manuscripts to languish. A few were quietly destroyed, judged heretical or too dangerous. The result was uneven. Certain ideas of Paracelsus spread widely: his use of chemicals in medicine, his doctrine that the dose makes the poison. But his prophetic writings, his attacks on authority, in his most radical visions, were buried in silence. This selectivity shaped how history remembered him. For centuries, Paracelsus was recalled as a bold physician, but not as the radical thinker who had burned Galen in Basel. Only in the 19th and 20th centuries did scholars begin to recover the suppressed texts, piecing together the fuller picture. A man who was as much mystic and prophet as he was physician. Even today, his corpus is incomplete, riddled with missing works, uncertain attributions, and tantalizing references to treatises never found. The story of these absences is instructive. Knowledge does not survive simply because it is written. It survives because it is copied, preserved, allowed. What we have of Paracelsus exists because some chose to save it. What we do not have was lost because some chose to neglect, suppress, or destroy it. The ashes of Basel remind us that knowledge can be consumed as easily as fire consumes paper. Yet the fragments also endure stubbornly. In Strasbourg, in Augsburg, in Vienna, manuscripts survived in odd corners, sometimes overlooked for centuries. Disciples of Paracelsus copied his words, hiding them in private collections. Printers eventually dared to release more, though often altered. Through these scattered traces, the fuller voice of Paracelsus still reaches us, angry, visionary, impatient, convinced that God had written cures into nature for humanity to discover, and what of the writings we cannot recover. He spoke often of secrets too dangerous to reveal fully. Did he develop formulas for remedies that might have saved lives centuries sooner? Did he explore chemical principles we would only later rediscover in modern laboratories? Or did the missing works consist only of unfinished drafts, too chaotic to endure? The silence of history leaves these questions unresolved. What is certain is that Paracelsus became a symbol of defiance. The bonfire of Basel remains one of the most vivid gestures in the history of medicine, a rejection of authority, an embrace of direct experience. Its ashes, both literal and metaphorical, remind us that ideas can be burned but not wholly destroyed. They linger in fragments, waiting for rediscovery. And so, Paracelsus stands as both a figure of loss and of endurance. His missing works remind us of the fragility of knowledge. His surviving ones remind us of its persistence. And together, they leave us with a question that has no answer. What truths were written in the missing pages of his life, and how different might history have been if they had survived? At the turn of the 17th century, Prague was unlike any other city in Europe. While London and Paris pulsed with merchants, and Rome radiated religious authority, Prague, under Emperor Rudolph II, became something stranger, a court obsessed with secrets, filled with astrologers, alchemists, collectors of oddities, and artists of the bizarre. Rudolph II, a Habsburg emperor ruling from 1576 to 1612, is remembered less for wars or politics than for his fascination with the occult sciences. He withdrew from public life, preferring the solitude of his castle in Prague, where he gathered one of the greatest collections of alchemists Europe had ever seen. There, in workshops hidden behind stone walls, men in long robes bent over furnaces, distilling strange liquids, grinding minerals, and whispering of the philosopher's stone. Prague Castle became known as a palace of curiosities. Rudolph's court attracted figures like the English alchemist John Dee and his associate Edward Kelly, as well as Italian natural philosophers, German metallurgists, and Jewish mystics. The emperor poured vast sums of money into their experiments. He funded laboratories in the castle itself, stocked with alembics, crucibles, and elaborate furnaces. He ordered shipments of mercury, sulfur, and gold. He wanted nothing less than the secret of transmutation, the transformation of base metals into precious ones, and the promise of the elixir of life. The city around the castle reflected this obsession. Prague in Rudolph's time was alive with rumor, tales of furnaces burning day and night, of secret experiments conducted under imperial guard, of manuscripts locked away in chambers accessible only to the emperor. Ordinary citizens saw wagons of minerals arriving, guards escorting alchemists through the gates. Whispers of strange smells drifting from the castle at night. But what became of the writings produced in this feverish atmosphere? Many were lost. Historians know that Rudolph collected manuscripts from across Europe, alchemical treatises, mystical texts, even forbidden works. Some he bought, others he seized, still others he commissioned directly. Yet after his death, when the 30 Years' War swept across Europe, much of this collection vanished. Soldiers plundered Prague Castle, carrying away books and manuscripts. Some ended up in Sweden, some in Rome, others disappeared entirely. The Prague manuscripts became a legend. The lost writings of Rudolph's alchemists, fragments of which surface in libraries, but never as a whole. The fascination with these missing texts lies in what they might contain. Alchemists at Rudolph's court wrote constantly notes on experiments, recipes for transmutation, allegorical diagrams of furnaces and retorts, theological speculations about creation and decay. Some of these survive today in scattered collections, richly illustrated, dense with symbols. But many others are gone burned, stolen, misplaced. Scholars suspect that entire series of treatises once stored in Prague have no surviving copies. This raises a quiet but haunting question. Did the emperor himself order some of these writings destroyed, fearing they revealed too much, perhaps too little? For Rudolph's obsession was not simply about curiosity. It was about power. He believed that alchemy could strengthen his empire, secure his dynasty, and perhaps even grant him personal immortality. A failed experiment or a false promise might have been concealed, erased from the record. The daily lives of the alchemists themselves were less glamorous than rumors suggested. Records show they often petitioned Rudolph for more funds, more materials, more time. Some lived in modest quarters in the castle, others rented rooms in the city. They kept furnaces burning constantly, consuming vast amounts of fuel. Their hands bore chemical burns. Their lungs likely suffered from fumes of mercury and sulfur. They were, in many ways, laborers of fire skilled but precarious, dependent entirely on the emperor's patronage. Their manuscripts, filled with strange diagrams and coded language, were tools as much as records. They guarded secrets in allegory, ensuring that only initiates could read them. Today, these texts can seem incomprehensible. Drawings of serpents circling furnaces, suns and moons hovering above crucibles, riddles of transformation written in dense Latin. Yet behind the allegory lay practical recipes, proportions of metals, times of heating, sequences of distillation. The tragedy is how much of this work is now silent. We know from inventories that Rudolph's library contained hundreds of alchemical manuscripts, yet the 30 Years' War scattered them, and centuries of neglect erased more. The Prague manuscripts are thus not only about what survives, but about what is not, about the deliberate and accidental erasure of an emperor's obsession. Standing in Prague today, tourists walk through the castle's halls, past its Gothic windows and Renaissance courtyards, unaware that beneath these stones once lay secret furnaces and lost manuscripts. The city has preserved its architecture, but not its alchemical memory. And so we ask, what knowledge was written in those vanished texts? Were they only records of failed experiments, or did they contain insights into chemistry, medicine, or philosophy that slipped through history's cracks? Asterisk, behind the grandeur of Rudolph II's Prague castle was something stranger than diplomacy and ceremony. A library unlike any other in Europe. Not a library of orderly theology or law, but a collection of the obscure, the forbidden, the half-believed. Rudolph poured vast sums into acquiring alchemical manuscripts, books of astrology, works of Jewish mysticism, treatises on natural magic, and even oddities of art and science that blurred the line between wonder and superstition. Inventories from the period fragments preserved in archives list titles that span the spectrum. Deeper de Lapide, Philosophorum, Book of the Philosopher's Stone, Clavicula, Salomonis, The Key of Solomon, works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and dozens of anonymous recipe books filled with cryptic symbols and allegorical diagrams. He also collected Arabic and Hebrew manuscripts, some translated into Latin, some left untranslated. Valued for their mystery as much as for their content, the alchemists at his court produced new writings constantly. They recorded their experiments in notebooks, described their procedures in allegory, and illustrated their texts with elaborate drawings. Serpents consuming themselves, crowned figures pouring liquid into retorts, suns and moons hovering over furnaces. These manuscripts were both practical and mystical. On one level, they listed ingredients and steps for distillation or calcination. On another, they served as meditations on transformation, both material and spiritual. But here lies the problem: the fate of these texts after Rudolph's death. In 1612, when the emperor died, his successors had little interest in alchemy. 30 Years' War soon broke out, plunging Central Europe into chaos. In 1648, Swedish troops sacked Prague and carried off treasures from the castle, including many manuscripts. Some ended up in Uppsala, Stockholm, and other Swedish collections, where they remain today. Others vanished altogether. What was lost? Scholars can only guess. Contemporary reports describe rooms filled with manuscripts, cabinets stacked with parchment, vaults storing books locked away from public view. Some texts survive in fragments in Sweden, others in the Vatican, others scattered in obscure European libraries. But the Prague manuscripts, as a coherent collection, no longer exist. Their dispersal erased context, broke connections, and left us with fragments without their original order. This dispersal is significant because alchemical manuscripts were rarely straightforward. They relied on allegory, coded language, and cross-references. A text without its companion commentary could become incomprehensible. An illustration without its accompanying notes could be misread as pure symbol when it once described a practical recipe. The breaking apart of Rudolph's library was thus not only a loss of quantity, but of meaning, and yet hints remain. Some Swedish manuscripts bear inscriptions indicating they once belonged to Rudolph's collection. Marginal notes in Latin or German refer to the emperor's copy. Few texts list experiments conducted in Prague itself, naming furnaces or assistants. These glimpses confirm that Rudolph's obsession generated a flood of writing, but they also deepen the mystery. If so much remains scattered, how much more has been lost entirely. Daily life at the court intertwined with this hidden library. Visitors describe seeing alchemists moving through corridors with manuscripts tucked under their arms, or gathering in Rudolph's chambers to present texts copied or translated at his request. The manuscripts were currency gifts to win favor, tokens of patronage, promises of secrets. To present the emperor with a rare treatise could mean securing years of support. To withhold or falsify could mean disgrace. It is easy to imagine the atmosphere, furnaces burning, experiments ongoing, while in a nearby chamber scribes copied ancient texts by candlelight. Kate and the emperor himself leafed through manuscripts filled with symbols he could not fully understand but believed to hold power. Books were not only sources of knowledge, they were talismans, objects of magic in their own right. But we must ask, when the library broke apart, what did history lose? Were these manuscripts mere repetitions of familiar alchemical lore copied endlessly across Europe? Or did some contain unique insights, practical notes from experiments conducted at Prague, lost forever in the chaos of war? Asterisk, when Rudolph II died in 1612, his body was laid to rest in Prague, but his library of wonders did not rest with him. It lingered in the castle for a few decades, increasingly neglected by rulers with little patience for alchemy. The emperor's heirs faced more pressing concerns: rebellions, debts, and the gathering storm of religious conflict that would soon ignite into the 30 Years' War. What Rudolph had spent decades collecting was gradually treated as eccentric baggage, curiosities, rather than treasures. In 1648, Swedish troops marched into Prague during the war's final campaigns. The sack of the city was brutal, and Rudolph's library was plundered. Soldiers carted away manuscripts, artworks, and scientific instruments. Many of these manuscripts found their way to Sweden, where they remain in collections in Uppsala and Stockholm. Others vanished burned in fires, lost to damp cellars, or stolen into private hands, never to resurface. The dispersal of the Prague manuscripts marked the end of Rudolph's dream. His court of alchemy broken, his legacy scattered. The fragments that survive are tantalizing. Some describe alchemical procedures in detailed distillations, sublimations, calculations of planetary influences. Others are purely symbolic, filled with images of crowned figures, suns and moons, serpents and lions. Some combine both, showing how practical recipes were embedded in allegory, a veil to protect secrets from the uninitiated. Still others hint at bold ambitions, notes on transmutations supposedly achieved, recipes for elixirs of long life, diagrams of universal processes. Whether these were sincere or symbolic is difficult to say, but they showed the ambition of the alchemists Rudolph gathered. What was lost is harder to measure. Inventories suggest dozens, perhaps hundreds, of manuscripts once present in Prague are now missing. Among them may have been unique records of experiments conducted under Rudolph's patronage, texts that would reveal what the alchemists of his court actually attempted day by day. Without them, we are left with rumor, whispers of furnaces burning day and night, of alchemists claiming success only to vanish when questioned, of manuscripts locked in cabinets that were never opened again. The legend of the Prague manuscripts grew in later centuries. Occultists in the 17th and 18th centuries spoke of lost books from Rudolph's library that contained secrets too powerful to be revealed. Some claimed that the Philosopher's Stone itself had once been glimpsed in Prague. Others believed the manuscripts held universal recipes that, if recovered, would transform science. These legends exaggerated what was likely more mundane: notes, drafts, allegories. But the aura of loss gave them power. For historians, the Prague manuscripts are not only about alchemy, they are about the fragility of knowledge. A single war, a single plunder, A few decades of neglect these were enough to scatter a collection that had taken decades and vast resources to assemble. Cana, today, we can only reconstruct pieces, never the whole. A silence of the missing manuscripts is as eloquent as the fragments that remain. And yet, the legacy of Rudolph's court endures in another way. His obsession with alchemy created a network of knowledge across Europe. Alchemists traveled to Prague, corresponded with each other, carried ideas back to their homelands, and even if many manuscripts vanished, the influence spread. Prague became a node in the web of early modern science, a place where mysticism, alchemy, and experiment mingled. So what remains of the emperor's dream? A few manuscripts in Sweden, a handful in the Vatican, scattered fragments in libraries, a reputation for eccentricity, questions we cannot answer. Did Rudolph's alchemists achieve anything more than allegory? Were their manuscripts erased because they failed, or because they came too close to truths others feared? The silence of those missing texts is its own testimony. It reminds us that history is always incomplete, that archives are fragile, and sometimes what is erased shapes memory as much as what is preserved. And so, the Prague manuscripts leave us with a question. When knowledge is scattered and erased, is it gone forever? Or does it live on in whispers, in legends, and in the fragments that refuse to be silenced? Asterisk, in the rolling countryside of Yorkshire, once stood a small Augustinian priory at Ripley, compared to the grandeur of Westminster or Canterbury. Ripley was modest and ordinary house of canons who lived by routine prayer, study, and the management of local lands. Yet, within this quiet setting, something unusual took place. Among their manuscripts, the monks of Ripley preserved and copied works of alchemy, in an age when such writings could be considered suspect, even heretical. These monks left behind a peculiar legacy, fragments of alchemical chronicles that later generations struggled to interpret. The story of Ripley Priory is not one of flamboyant experiments with furnaces blazing day and night, as in Rudolph II's Prague. Instead, it is a story of careful copying, of monks hunched over desks, ink staining their fingers, patiently transcribing texts that mixed scripture with alchemical allegory. These manuscripts survived not because they were dramatic, but because they were boring folded into ordinary monastic life, hidden in plain sight among theological treatises and devotional works. The English church had a complicated relationship with alchemy. On one hand, many clerics were fascinated by it, seeing in its language of purification and transformation a parallel to spiritual truths. To purify metals was like purifying the soul. To transform lead into gold was a metaphor for divine grace. On the other hand, church authorities warned against charlatans who promised riches through false alchemy, and against the pride of trying to imitate God's creation. The monks of Ripley walked this fine line. The manuscripts they copied were not grand promises of transmutation, but compilations of knowledge, recipes for distillation, notes on the properties of minerals, allegorical poems about transformation. One such text attributed to Ripley's monks included verses comparing the philosopher's stone to Christ himself, the ultimate purifier. Other recorded instructions for the preparation of medicinal elixirs, blending alchemy with healing. What makes these texts significant is their survival. While many monastic libraries were destroyed during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, fragments from Ripley were preserved, carried into private collections, later resurfacing in libraries centuries afterward. Their endurance gives us a rare glimpse into how ordinary English monks engaged with alchemy, not as heretics, not as visionaries, but as patient scribes, preserving what they found curious or useful. Life at Ripley would have seemed uneventful to an outside observer. The canons followed the daily rhythm of prayer, work, and study. They managed agricultural lands, brewed ale, tended sheep, and kept records of rents and tides, but in their scriptorium, amid the copying of saints' lives and sermons, they also copied alchemical verses. Okay? Imagine a monk pausing in the middle of transcribing Augustine to shift to a text about Mercury's marriage with sulfur. It was a quiet mingling of worlds, unnoticed except in hindsight. The chronicles that survive suggest that Ripley's monks did not invent new theories, but preserved existing ones. They drew from continental sources Latin texts that had filtered into England through university circles and itinerant clerics. Yet their decision to copy them at all is telling, shows a curiosity, a willingness to entertain ideas at the margins of orthodoxy. Perhaps they saw alchemy as harmless metaphor. Perhaps they believed it could heal. Perhaps they simply found the texts fascinating and worth preserving. And yet, much of what they copied was later lost. Some manuscripts vanished in the turmoil of the dissolution. Others survive only in fragments, their pages reused in bindings for account books. Modern scholars reconstruct them painstakingly, piecing together scraps found in archives. The result is tantalizing. Glimpses of a hidden monastic engagement with alchemy, just enough to confirm its presence, not enough to know its full extent. The question that lingers is this: were the monks of Ripley merely scribes, or were they practitioners? Did they, in their quiet priory, ever light furnaces and attempt the transformations they copied in ink? Or did their interests remain purely textual, preserved only in the safety of parchment and prayer? Asterisk. To understand the monks of Ripley, you must picture the daily rhythm of a late medieval priory. The bell marked the hours, matins in the dark before dawn, lauds at sunrise, then prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Between these cycles of prayer, the canons worked tending fields, managing tenants, brewing ale, and, in the scriptorium, copying texts. Most of these were devotional or practical: psalters, sermons, accounts of saints' lives, legal documents. Among them, tucked quietly, were alchemical writings. The line between text and practice in monasteries was often blurred. Alchemy, for many monks, was not the pursuit of wealth, but of knowledge. Okay? It promised remedies, new medicines, better dyes for cloth, stronger metals for bells and tools. These were not abstract promises. For a small priory like Ripley, strapped for resources, any improvement in material life mattered. A better tincture could help treat illness in the infirmary. Stronger alloy could reinforce a bell cracked by constant use. Alchemy was not only a dream of gold, it was a craft of survival. Surviving fragments suggest that the monks experimented in modest ways. Notes record simple distillations, extracting essential oils from herbs, preparing spirits of wine, creating medicinal syrups. These were tasks within reach of a small priory, using equipment not far removed from brewing. Indeed, monastic brewing and alchemy share tools: furnaces, alembics, vessels of clay and glass, in the boundary between kitchen, brewery, and infirmary. Alchemical practice could emerge without seeming unusual, but there were limits. Some texts in Ripley's collection reference the philosopher's stone, the ultimate goal of alchemy, the transmutation of metals into gold, and the production of the elixir of life. Did the monks pursue this, or did they read it allegorically, as many clerics did? Verse comparing the stone to Christ suggests they saw it symbolically, a metaphor for purification and resurrection. Yet, we cannot rule out quiet experiments conducted in the margins of prayer, with furnaces glowing at night. The Church's position on such practices was cautious. Alchemy had been condemned when linked to fraud, but tolerated when framed as practical or spiritual. The monks of Ripley likely knew this balance well. Their texts often blended scriptural language with alchemical imagery, framing chemical processes as reflections of divine mysteries. In this way, they could copy and perhaps experiment without fear of heresy. What makes the Ripley material fascinating is its ordinariness. These were not famed alchemists like Paracelsus or courtly magicians like John Dee. They were rural canons, managing sheep and crops, and in their spare time, copying verses about mercury and sulfur. Their manuscripts remind us that alchemy was not only the pursuit of eccentric geniuses, was part of the texture of ordinary, learned life in the late Middle Ages. The survival of their writings is fragmentary, and this is telling. In Henry VIII dissolved monasteries in the 1530s. Libraries were scattered, books sold or destroyed, manuscripts torn up for use as binding scraps. Ripley's alchemical texts were not spared. Pages were reused in account ledgers or lost entirely. What we have today are shreds, rediscovered in archives, pieced together by patient scholars. These fragments whisper of a wider engagement now, mostly erased. The tediousness of reconstruction reflects the tediousness of the monk's work itself. Hours spent copying cramped Latin script, repeating verses they may not have fully understood, preserving diagrams of furnaces and allegories of transformation. Boring work, perhaps, yet it preserved knowledge that otherwise might have vanished entirely. Without such copying, we would know less of alchemies spread into rural monastic life. But the unresolved question remains: did Ripley's monks believe in the literal transformation of metals, or did they see in alchemy only allegory? In medicine, were their furnaces truly lit in secret, or were their crucibles only imagined in ink? Asterisk, when you follow the paper trail of English alchemy into the 16th century, it ends more often in a bindery than in a furnace. That is the quiet truth behind the fate of monastic books. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, 1536 to 1541, did not only empty cloisters and sell roofs for lead, it also uprooted libraries slowly, bureaucratically, and with 1,000 small acts whose cumulative effect was erasure. Shelves were inventoried, lots auctioned, parchment reused. What had once been patient decades of copying turned into a few weeks of dispersal. The alchemical chronicles we glimpsed in the last section's verses about Mercury's marriage to sulfur, lists of simples for the infirmary, allegories of purification were caught in that administrative weather. You would have heard the change long before you saw it. Bells that had marked the hours were hauled down, their notes silenced. The sound of carts replaced a chant as commissioners cataloged goods and carted off plate. In the scriptorium, cupboards were opened and their contents weighed as vellum, not as words. The crown's agents were not, for the most part, vandals. They were practical men charged with turning monasteries into money. A calfskin codex that had taken a winter to copy might be torn up to stiffen a new account book for a royal receiver. Alchemical poems too odd to sell, too foreign to the needs of a parish, were ideal for binding waste. And so, Lionstad had once compared the philosopher's stone to the Paschal mystery, vanished into the spine of someone's rent roll. This is how knowledge ends when it is unlucky, not in a fire, but in a ledger. The monks or canons who had copied such material could do little. Some tried to squirrel away volumes in chests. Others bartered manuscripts to local gentry for small favors. A steward might save a few books for his master's closet, where they gathered dust for a century until an antiquary noticed them. Most did not find even that narrow rescue. If you track what survived, you begin to see the pattern. Leaves with musical notation pretty, and obviously liturgicals sometimes found their way into parish chests. Learned scholastic texts, useful for schools, could be sold to universities. But the hybrid writings we have followed here, half devotional, half alchemical, practical in a priory infirmary, yet opaque to a town stationer, slipped through the sieve. The very ordinariness that had once protected them in a quiet house now counted against them. There is another wrinkle that will matter to you if you value names. Ripley today echoes most loudly in the person of George Ripley C. 1415 to 1490, a canon regular and one of the most influential English alchemical writers. The lavish Ripley scrolls, copied in the 16th and 17th centuries and preserved in places like the British Library and the Bodleian, keep his name alive, coiling dragons, crowned kings, suns, and moons, all resting on a lattice of morally charged allegory and brisk practical marginalia. In the centuries after dissolution, scraps bearing the name Ripley the writer or Ripley the Yorkshire place sometimes became conflated in antiquarian notes and auction catalogues. A binding fragment stamped D. Ripley might refer to provenance, not authorship. A verse after Ripley could mean the poet, not a house. What we have called here the monks of Ripley is a way to point to two entangled threads, a northern English clerical milieu that preserved alchemical writing, and the later gravitational pull of George Ripley's name that drew disparate scraps into his orbit. The confusion is itself a symptom of loss. When catalogs grow thin, names do the work that context once did. Inside the houses that kept such texts, practice and reading overlapped without advertisement. A small still in an infirmary could purify spirits of wine for a digestive cordial. A kitchen furnace could double as a place to calcine shells for antacids or to make a stronger lye. None of this looked like transmutation. It looked like housekeeping. When commissioners came, they listed one little still, 3 glass vessels to mortar, and moved on. The vocabulary of the inventory was not built to notice an intellectual tradition. It was built to turn objects into coin. Yet, the people at the edge of this story did notice. John Leland, the king's antiquary, hurried through the shrunken libraries and lamented what he could not save. John Bale, polemicist and collector, compiled lists of authors and titles and railed against the loss, even as he helped decide what was worth preserving. Their notes, short, fussy, and sometimes wrong, are precious because they record traces before the trail went cold. A title here, a first line there, the name of a house, the name of a scribe. For alchemical material, even such crumbs matter. They tell you that a verse existed in a cloister. They tell you that a prior valued a treatise enough to have it copied. They tell you that the book was present on a particular shelf on a particular day, just before it vanished into a binder's. Paste dot from those crumbs. A modern reconstruction proceeds by steps that are as undramatic as they are necessary. A parish register from the 1540s opens, and in its spine you find a strip with a lion and sun motif, familiar from Rippian allegory. It's in a box of estate papers in a county record office. A canceled bond is wrapped in parchment, covered with a table of weights and measures, and the Latin for fix the spirit with the body, a commonplace in alchemical recipes. In a university library, a Samiel band, a collected volume, mixes a sermon on Lent with a brief tract on the virtues of antimony. The end leaves are from a lost medicinal notebook. None of these finds answers your questions outright, but together they show a life world in which monks and canons read, copied, and occasionally practiced an alchemy that was closer to pharmacy than to legend. You should not imagine, however, that dissolution simply erased and left a void. Also forced a migration. Books moved from cloister to gentry house, from gentry house to physician's shop, from physician's shop to printer. The statute of 1404 against multiplying gold and silver had already cooled open claims about transmutation, yet 15th century royal licenses occasionally allowed specific men to work the art of alchemy in the hope of revenue. After the monasteries fell, that cautious, semi-official tolerance shifted further from cloistered scribes toward lay experimenters. The language of alchemy bled into chemistry, saying, dyeing, salt-making, mineral medicine crafts that survived because they earned their keep. In that sense, part of Ripley's monastic world did not die, it simply took off its habit and went to town. The traces of continuity look dull until you realize they are the bridge. Parish accounts that replace Latin with English still pay for a quart of aquavita for the poor sick. Borough orders regulate the sale of oils and unguents distilled. London printers publish small manuals on distillation that reuse, without attribution, recipes once copied in cloisters. A provincial surgeon keeps a commonplace book in which remedies for ulcers sit beside a paragraph on the philosophic egg. Copied, it seems, because its metaphor pleased him. Through such minor channels, monastic alchemy survives as household practice. What, then, became of the specific cluster of text we have followed? Those Ripillian verses and practical notes preserved in a northern house. A few leaves reappear. In the 17th century, in the hands of antiquaries who are more interested in coats of arms than in furnaces. A handful of images live on in the Ripley scroll tradition, recopied and embellished long after the monastic originals are gone. A recipe or two surface in printed collections under titles so generic a book of secrets that provenance disappears. By the time scholarly catalogs in the 19th century begin to gather what is left, context has thinned to names and insipids. The monks who once copied the lines have no names at all. They are Anan, Canon, a brother of the house, the smallest possible subjects in the record. If you are listening for human outcomes rather than text, you can still hear them. Dissolution shaved livelihoods to the bone. Former canons took pensions, then took lodgings with relatives or in small towns. One might become a schoolmaster, another a notary, a third a chaplain in a gentleman's house. Skills learned in a scriptorium, careful copying, neat Latin, a sense for recipes translated awkwardly but not uselessly into lay life. A few carried their books with them as far as they could. An ex-canon's will might mention a book of physic notes left to a nephew. Another might list 2 scrolls of figures, meaning perhaps the kind of alchemical emblems that later collectors prized. These are not dramas. They are the quiet aftershocks of an administrative revolution by the end of the century. What had once been an in-house habit of copying had become, for most English readers, an import from print shops in London or the Low Countries. The older monastic idiom allegory nested and prayer-reeled to a workshop idiomassing, test, repeat. Theological frames thinned, recipes fattened. A change of shelf became a change of mind, and yet one last paradox remains to keep you awake. The dissolution that destroyed so many manuscripts also created the conditions under which a handful of pages, spectacular survivals, those sumptuous Ripley scrolls, the few miscellanies that escaped being cut, became visible and collectible. At the monastic shelves endured intact. The scrolls might have remained one set of images among many. Torn loose from their context by loss, they acquired an aura. They became the image of English alchemy, and through them the name Ripley reached us across the centuries more clearly than the ordinary books whose company he kept. Erasure, perversely, sharpened one fragment into a symbol, so the chronic question that has carried us through this story returns to you. Those monks or canons who copied, occasionally distilled, and almost never boasted, were they practitioners in any full sense, or caretakers of a language that others would later put to hotter use? If we had their missing notebooks, whole no leaves in bindings, no verses in wastewood, we find small furnaces described in the infirmary, or only allegories that sanctify prudent remedies. Asterisk. When you hear the name Nicholas Flamel, you likely think of an alchemist whose hands supposedly turned quicksilver into gold. If you walk the right bank of Paris today, you can still stand before a stone house at 51 Rue de Montmorency and read a late medieval lintel inscription invoking charity for the poor and prayers for the dead. The house is real. The inscription is real. The endowments that Flamel and his wife Peronelle left to Parisian churches are recorded in civic documents. What is not so clear is the little book that sits at the center of his Legend of Vanished manuscript, said to contain a recipe, a sequence, a way of working upon metals that promised gold, and, by allegory, something like salvation. It is the perfect kind of object for boring history. No fireworks, no preserved laboratory, only contracts, wills, stonework, and a printed narrative that appeared 2 centuries after Flamel died, begin with the man, not the myth. Flamel c. 1332-1418 was a libraire, jeweler, a sworn bookseller, inscribed connected to the University of Paris's regulated book trade. In practice, that meant copying, correcting, and selling manuscripts, contracting scribes and illuminators, advancing parchment, and navigating the university's price controls. His profession was administrative and precise. He would have known how many pages a quire could take, how long a scribe could copy before the hand grew careless, where to find a binder willing to resew a gathering torn by an impatient student. Much later, this ordinary trade in parchment and ink would be recast as a cover for alchemical pursuits. In his own century, it was a respectable livelihood. Perenelle brought wealth of her own whether through previous marriages, inheritance, or well-managed property. Together, the couple acquired rents and houses and spread their prosperity in the socially expected ways. Chantries endowed for the saying of masses, window glass paid for in parish churches, house gifts to the poor. Their names appear in donor lists and notarial acts, which is why historians can reconstruct a picture of their finances with some confidence. None of these documents says gold from Mercury. They say a house on the Rue des Écrivains, a rent due on the Sunday after Easter for livres tournois to repair a chapel. The bureaucracy of late medieval parasites, cadasters. Its guild registers preserves the Flamel story in lines of cramped script designed for accounting, not for legend. The legend, however, grew around a book, according to a narrative first printed in 1612. Nearly 200 years after Flamel's death, he purchased a small volume for 2 florins from a stranger at a bookstall. It was called The Book of Abraham the Jew, written, so the story goes, on bark or fine parchment, gilded and engraved, bound in copper plates. In it, a Jewish sage, priest, prince, Levite, outlined through hieroglyphic figures, emblems, and enigmatic captions, the work that would produce the philosopher's stone. Flamel, the tale continues, labored over those figures for decades, consulted scholars, and eventually, with the help of a learned traveler, penetrated the allegory. On the 17th of January, 1382, he achieved the white work, transmuting mercury into silver. On the 25th of April of the same year, he succeeded in the red work, producing gold. The dates are precise in the printed tale. Precision is part of its rhetorical power. If you approach this story as a historian, you begin not with astonishment, but with provenance. The only detailed account of the Book of Abraham appears long after Flamel's lifetime. The 1612 textan exposition of the hieroglyphical figures presents itself as if authored by Flamel, yet its style and preoccupations belong to the early 17th century, when printers across Europe issued alchemical compendia for a lay readership hungry for secrets. The original book that supposedly taught Flamel his art has never surfaced. There is no medieval catalog entry, no inventory description, no confiscation list, no bequest. Only the printed narrative and later retellings. This is why scholars class the Book of Abraham as a vanished recipe, merely lost, but known only through a secondary, late witness whose authority cannot be verified. Still, it is not sensible to sweep the whole matter aside. Legends adhere to facts that are dull but stubborn. Flamel and Perenelle did occupy that house on the Rue de Montmorency. They financed altarpieces and charities. Their well-documented generosity helped fuel the later suspicion that their money came from transmutation. In Paris, in the later 14th century, did have its alchemical undercurrent, itinerant practitioners, quiet workshops, royal interests alternating with condemnation. The papal bull spondent, Pariter et non-exhibent, 1317, had warned against alchemists who promise what they do not deliver. Yet princes and urban elites kept hiring metallurgists to test ores, refine coinage, and assay claims. In such a city, a scribe who knew the trade in strange books could easily brush the edges of a subculture that spoke in emblems of sulfur and mercury, regimens and rotations, and color changes in the glass. Picture the material life that surrounds the legend, a bookstall table on the Rue Neuve Notre Dame, or by the Petit Pont, stacked with quires of vellum and a few small bound volumes, their clasps shining dull in the light.